Good morning, everyone. This is Chris Peterson coming to you from Michigan State University this morning for the fifth week of our MetroAg MOOC. And we're going to cover a somewhat different topic than the last couple of weeks, because essentially we are going to focus on this fundamental question of how are these value creation strategies that we've been talking about since the beginning of the course, how are they developed and how are they implemented? Hopefully at this point in the MOOC, you've already begun to think about how would I apply these things in my own setting. Well, I had the experience of working with the Transforum staff over the 6 years of the Transforum project in the Netherlands. I had served on the International Advisory Board for the whole project. So as a board member, I had a vantage point throughout the 6-year history on the various things that Transforum did and the various projects in which they were engaged. In addition, I was able to put 8 weeks of concentrated effort during the last year the Transforum existed in looking across 30 projects that was done under the Transforum model and attempt to draw out the learning from the collective group of 30 projects. And it was that testing and learning that hopefully allows me some credibility today to articulate what we think are the new operating principles that are necessary if you're going to do this kind of project. And then I will wrap up with some conclusions and cautions about using the Transforum model and its principles. Just another word of background. I am a faculty member here at Michigan State University, and I direct an organization called the Product Center, Food, Ag, Bio, where we're working with brand new entrepreneurs and existing businesses to take new products to market that are related to food, agriculture, or biomass. And so we are constantly searching for new value creation strategies for our various clients. And so I've had a long-standing interest now in thinking about how we can look at issues of sustainable development and create sound value propositions for ventures that can grow out of this 3P notion of sustainability. So moving on, the fundamental question that I want to frame today is how are these value creation strategies developed and implemented? So let's set up the question and give you a first pass answer, and then we'll move on to the details, as it were. You know, over the last 3 weeks in particular, you have seen the details of 6 very successful projects that came out of the Transforum experience. And those projects were presented in the context of 3 distinct kinds of value creation strategies. We had sustainable diversification, we had sustainable revaluation, and we had sustainable intensification. Well, I would hope by this point in the course, you're all sort of asking yourselves, well, gee, I'd like to do this at home, where I currently am working and residing. So how can I create and run projects that will result in similar kinds of value creation where you live and work? And really it comes down then to, can we articulate a set of operating principles by which projects that you might engage in, how those projects should operate in order to successfully manage sustainable development? Well, it turns out there are 5 operating principles that I observed in my research related to studying the 30 Transforum projects, the 6 that you already heard about over the last couple of weeks, and 24 additional projects. And they're listed here in this diagram, and essentially the projects that were able to follow these 5 principles tended to have a lot stronger performance in terms of shared value creation. And again, just getting these ideas in your mind for the moment, you need to focus on impact and process performance, and we'll make that distinction pretty clearly for you here in a couple of minutes. You must carefully manage the initiating conditions of any sustainable development project. You've got to practice multi-stakeholder engagement every day in every way within such projects. In addition, you have to practice innovation management, because innovation is central to success. And managing innovation goes beyond sort of traditional project management processes. And then finally, there is a very special role to practice monitoring and reflection in these kinds of projects. Now, hopefully, by the time we get done today, all 5 of these operating principles will make good sense. So let's move on then to how we found these principles in terms of how did we test and learn from the Transforum model. Well, the Transforum model really began with a set of motivating assumptions. In other words, these were assumptions that every project was to live by, if you will. And so let's quickly think about these 5 assumptions. That sustainable development is a dynamic system property. That is to say, sustainable development really doesn't have a closed form definition. We can't say with great specificity what is or isn't sustainable. We really have to think about what is more or less sustainable as we move through time. And part of that has to be the continual search for a realizable meaning out of the multiple value dimensions that are going to be present in any such project. Dimensions such as people, planet, and profit. The second key assumption was that sustainable development needs system innovation. Simply doing what we've always done will not be enough to get us where we need to be. We need to think about the hardware, software, and orgware of agriculture if we are really going to create innovation and move towards more sustainable trajectories. The third fundamental assumption is that system innovation requires a multi-stakeholder approach. All stakeholders bring existing knowledge and concerns to the process of sustainable development. And their collective presence is really needed if you're going to, and I'm realizing I skipped ahead in my notes here a second. Let's go back and pick up the sustainable innovation is a non-linear learning process. Normal science approach, whereas we formulate a problem, we go off to our laboratories and find a solution, and then we come back to apply that solution. Those don't work in regard to sustainable development. They have to give way to a messier process of consensus building, joint knowledge creation, and reflective learning. Well, then that leads to the fourth assumption, that system innovation requires active participation of all of the relevant players. We have to have individuals from knowledge institutions, like universities. We have to have the presence of governmental and political bodies. We have to have civil society organizations, and we need to have the business community involved. And then finally, as an operating assumption, this multi-stakeholder approach implies that you have to have transdisciplinary collaboration of all of the players. Complex, messy problems do not know disciplinary bounds. All relevant skills and knowledge must be combined and extended to create the new knowledge that will evolve the system. Now, it turns out that if you separate these five operating assumptions, the first three of these really say that you're looking at a wicked problem. Now, this is a term that comes out of the social planning literature of the 1970s. Also, interestingly enough, it comes out of advanced computer systems work. But the notion is you have a very complex, messy, value-laden, and as a result, ultimately unsolvable problem. You can't talk in absolutes about this is sustainable and this isn't. We can only talk about moving more or less effectively towards the goals of sustainable development. And the second set of assumptions here, assumptions 4 and 5, really give us the first keys into managing the process. It has to be a multi-stakeholder engagement, and that multi-stakeholder engagement needs to result in transdisciplinary collaboration. So again, the idea of these 5 assumptions was that any project that was funded by Transforum and worked with Transforum had to live by these assumptions if it was to be supported and moved forward as a project. So how do we know that this model works? Well, I've already indicated that we examined the case histories of 30 of these practice projects that were done during the Transform program. And essentially what we did is we used a set of 3 deeply knowledgeable jurors about each of the projects. And so who constituted the 3 jurors changed depending upon the project that we were looking at. And then we did an assessment of each project's level of performance, and we had 14 attributes that I'll share here briefly. And then we assessed various explanatory attributes for each of the projects, and there were actually a total of 76 of those. And I know this sounds like a lot of attributes, but we are attempting to use this idea of case-based research where we had information from the 30 projects to at least come to some preliminary conclusions about what made sense in terms of explaining this performance. We then grouped the 30 projects into performance quartiles, ranging from the highest performing projects to the lowest performing projects. Now, as you might imagine, the 6 that you've been introduced to over the last couple of weeks come from the high performance category. But notice that Transforum did a lot of learning because not every project ended up being in that high performance category. Then we observed the influence of the explanatory attributes across the quartiles, and we found explanatory patterns within and across the quartiles, and then finally that has allowed us to draw some conclusions about the effectiveness of the model. So let's begin and think about the performance outcomes. It turns out that in a project like this, you really have to focus on both impact outcomes and process outcomes. Impact outcomes are things like people, planet, and profit. These are the fundamental outcomes that you want to change in the system. But in addition to monitoring those kind of outcomes and producing those kinds of outcomes, you've also got to care about the process that project participants go through as you build the project. You have to have engaged stakeholders. And what you need to understand about stakeholders is that they can empower the success of the impact outcomes, or they can veto a project's success. To, in essence, have a project that focuses only on people, planet, and profit as sort of objective outcomes will very often find that they come up with an elegant solution that stakeholders really aren't prepared to implement. Or vice versa, if a project becomes mired in process, you'll have an endless set of debates that will never, in fact, create any real change in the dimension of people, planet, and profit. So you've got to care about both of these sets of outcomes if a project is to be successful. So we looked at 14 attributes of performance. We asked our jurors to rate them on a Likert scale running from 1 being low performance to 5 being high performance for each of these projects. So let's actually look at the attributes. On the impact side, obviously our people, profit, and planet attributes are there. But in addition, some of the projects were really designed to fundamentally plan for a value creation methodology or projects, whereas others were able to push beyond planning to full investment. And then there were some projects that existed long enough under the time span of Transforum that not only did they plan and invest, but they actually got to the point of harvesting the actual value. And obviously, the further a project got towards harvesting actual value, the higher its performance rating would be in terms of the impact outcomes. And what we observed is that the 3 Ps were equally balanced within our quartiles of projects and declined across the quartiles. And in addition, we did see the pattern that all projects at one level or another worked at the planning activities, but fewer got to the investment stage and fewer still got to the harvest stage. That is, actually achieving the values that were planned for. So we have a great mix of projects in terms of performance. And again, you can see from the average impact ratings that as you went from the high performance quartile to the low performance quartile, we went from an average of 3.6 on the Likert scale of 1 to 5 down to 1.5. So there was substantial differences in the performance outcomes. Now, how did we measure the process outcomes? Well, essentially, we began by saying, did innovation actually happen during the project? Did action learning actually happen? Did the Kinji partners were they really engaged in what was going on? Now, we really didn't introduce the acronym KINGI before this, but K stands for knowledge institutions, E stands for entrepreneurs and business, N stands for NGOs or societal organizations, and G stands for government engaged in the I of innovation. So in essence, it's this four-sided stakeholder paradigm that was critical to Transforum. Did the partners actually take ownership? And again, you can see a couple of the other variables that we used as well. And again, what we discovered that all 8 attributes were relatively balanced within each of the quartiles, but declined across the quartiles. And again, the average process rating here went from 3.9 at the highest quartile of performance down to 1.5. But the critical thing to understand here is that performance did vary widely across the projects, and impact and process outcomes really did matter. We didn't find a project where there was high impact but low performance or process outcomes, and nor vice versa did we find a project that had high process outcomes that then had low impact outcomes. These things tend to move together, and if you're going to manage projects, you need to assure that you're focused not only on the impacts of people, planet, and profit, but also the process outcomes of being sure that innovation, learning, and collaboration really occur within the project. Well, the first set of explanatory variables that we looked at in detail had to do with how these various projects got initiated. And it turns out that projects that don't get started very well don't end very well, and vice versa. And in particular, we looked at attributes like how a project was initiated, who initiated the project, and why was the project initiated. And notice that in our high performers, we discover that all 3 of those attributes were very strongly influential in the positive sense, but 2 of the 3 attributes tended to be very negative in the case of our low performers. So how you start these projects, who you have involved, are very, very important, and they fall out of those initiating assumptions, because the how it gets initiated has to do with really being focused on innovation and sustainable development, and the who has to do with having all of the KINGI partners present. Now, it turns out that the initiating conditions for the project's process itself tended to also be important, but the correlation here wasn't as strong as in the first category of how the project itself got initiated. Well, having seen these outcomes, I did some in-depth interviews following these ratings, and really want to suggest to you that in addition to those 5 operating assumptions that we've already talked about, Transforum developed across its work a real strategy for project formation and guidance. In terms of how a project got formulated, there was real work between the staff of Transforum and the project personnel to assure the presence of those 5 Transforum assumptions. There were multiple reviews going back and forth between the Transforum project staff and the projects in the field to assure that those assumptions were really going to be followed in the execution of the project. And so there was a key role for the Transforum project directors. There were people within Transforum who were really assigned to oversee the various projects and see that these assumptions were carried out. And then over the life of the project, there was a continuing set of guidance practices where there were multiple reviews and contact points between the project directors and on the Transforum side and the project field people on the other side. And they worked to keep the projects networked and communicating with each other. And again, it became clear to me as I did the in-depth interviews that these Transforum project directors played this critical role of not just forming the projects properly at the beginning, but then seeing that the projects evolved under the guidance of these 5 operating assumptions. And I really believe, based on the interviews, that the Kinsey partners and the 3P impacts would not have been engaged without this strategy being in place. How you form and guide your project based on multi-stakeholder engagement and a real focus on 3P impacts, you need to have both of these things at the heart of any project that you do in the arena of sustainable development. If we move on to the second major set of practices that we looked at then, we really picked up this notion of the multi-stakeholder engagement. And here are more influential attributes in terms of the project's membership. You know, who engaged, and an interesting change of that question, who was not engaged, how did the who change over the life of the project, and what kind of internal champion emerged out of the project membership. Well, notice that we have very positive who sort of characteristics for our high performers, and notice what the big negative was for our low performers. The notion that they really had an incomplete set of Kinsey partners, because who was not engaged with them ended up creating problems in the low performers. And so I think we have at least some strong correlated evidence that this issue of really practicing multi-stakeholder engagement is critical. And then we looked at a number of potentials for conflict within the project group itself. And again, you will discover that these things tended to be managed in positive ways when it comes to the high performance projects. But for the low performance projects, you can see that these issues of what divided the group, the level of disagreement, the level of trust, all became quite negative for the low performers. So managing the conflict within these kinds of projects that are wicked in nature, as I described earlier in my remarks, becomes absolutely critical to success. The third set of attributes that we looked into was what were the practices in the various projects around innovation management. Because we could presume that innovation needs its own special kind of managerial approach. And indeed, we tended to see that emerge as well as we compare and contrast the high performers from the low performers here. How the three Ps got considered was positive in absolutely all of the high performing projects. As you might imagine, the need to reconcile incentives, the need to translate to find a common language and common incentives among the four Kinji partners. These were positive, but they weren't as strongly positive as we might have expected. On the other hand, look at the strategies that were used to experiment in action, innovate, action learning, new knowledge, and transdisciplinary collaboration. Notice how strongly positive those strategies were in the high performance group, and you see that they had either sort of neutral influence in the low performance, or in the case of action learning and transdisciplinary collaboration, these things really didn't work in those groups. Now, the critical point I want to make about these strategies for doing these various things, particularly the experiment in action one, is understand that you cannot allow the project to simply devolve into a debating society about creation of value. You've got to find ways within the process of the project to take experiments in action that test critical assumptions and critical assertions if you're going to have positive movement towards the kinds of impact outcomes that you want to have from any project that you might do. Now that leads me to the third element or third part of the transform model, because based on both the multi-stakeholder engagement attributes and the innovation management attributes, I did additional in-depth and follow-up interviews with various key people to understand how did learning actually happen. Well, it turns out that there was a real strategy that emerged from the transform work for doing monitoring and reflection within the projects. Because it turns out that this was absolutely essential to both stakeholder engagement and to innovation management. That if you didn't monitor and reflect what was happening within the projects in a very careful and conscious way, it wouldn't really have happened. And there came to be a very key role within each of the practice projects for what came to be called a process monitor. Someone who was assigned to the project with the explicit role of monitoring the innovation trajectory of the project, and to, in a soft way, intervene in the project to continually ask questions about, are we really pursuing the 3 Ps? Are we getting everyone's buy-in to the process? And are we getting the collaboration that we need? And how do we need to adjust our strategies? And the other thing that they tended to do was not allow the project group to avoid, as we tend to say, the elephant in the room. If there was really something going on that was constraining the creativity and the ability of the group to innovate, that wasn't being brought to the group's attention for solution, the process monitor played this critical role of bringing those issues to the attention of the group even to the point of calling a reflection workshop. Critical timeouts, if you will, where the members of the project group would come together to openly reflect on the process and solve process difficulties. And part of these reflection workshops were this very notion of stopping at key moments in the life of the project and saying to the group, what have we learned and what has our collaboration created? Now, again, based on my in-depth interviews, I really came to strongly believe that learning, collaboration, and innovation would not have happened without the presence of these process monitors and the reflection workshops. That in fact, learning seems to be a relatively unnatural human behavior in projects. And I would ask each of you to think about both successful and unsuccessful projects you've been engaged in across your career. And my guess is you would probably agree with me that reflection and learning doesn't happen nearly as much as it needs to. And if you're dealing with wicked problems like sustainable development, you have to be absolutely explicit in pursuing a strategy for monitoring and reflection. So, based on the study that I did of the Transforum projects and just had amazingly wonderful cooperation from the Transforum staff and people engaged in these projects, we really come to sort of the end of the study and we say the Transforum model really had three components. It had these 5 motivating assumptions that drove the projects. And along with those 5 assumptions, there were these 2 critical strategies about how the projects got formed and guided and how monitoring and reflection actually happened within the projects. And it is the sum of these 3 components that really comes to define the Transforum model. And then if we begin to think about what the research shows in terms of the performance assessment of the model, we see that impact and process outcomes proved useful measures of project performance, and that the influential attributes in terms of explanatory attributes tended to be associated with or led to higher performance in predicted ways, especially when you took into account the initiating conditions, innovation management, stakeholder engagement, and monitoring and reflection. So the conclusion of the research study is that the Transforum model performed quite well, and that in fact it is a model that we ought to draw learning from as we create projects wherever we may be in the world right now, to again think about how we would manage these various kinds of projects. Now, before I turn to articulating then the operating principles that come out of this Transforum work, let me do a couple of additional, or bring to the forefront a couple of additional patterns that we saw in the research work. So that, for example, across these 30 projects, 7 of the projects were actually formulated before the Transforum staff was fully in place. And notice, they were less successful as a group than the later projects that were fully formed under the Transforum assumptions. So there is some interesting correlation information across the 30 cases that suggests that full use of the transform model really did have an enhanced impact on performance. The other thing that I looked at is of the 23 projects that were done under the early and late assumptions, that I divided them into larger scale and smaller scale projects, because I think there's tended to be an argument that smaller scale projects have a greater chance for success in sustainability than larger scale projects. Well, again, the numbers we have here don't support that at all, that in fact both larger scale and smaller scale projects can benefit from utilizing the transform model. The other thing that I attempted to do was divide the 23 into more wicked and less wicked projects. And interestingly enough, the more wicked the project, the better the transform model worked. And what that suggests to me is that if you do have a sort of standard project that can be solved by linear science, then you don't need all of the extra apparatus of multi-stakeholder engagement and innovation management. But if you really are faced with a wicked problem, then you better be using the full model that transform worked through. The other thing that I did, and again we have some real problem with small numbers here, was to see if the type of innovation mattered, and it turns out that there isn't any really profound pattern here, and so the good news is the transform model would appear to work across a variety of innovation projects. So based on the research work here, what are then the new operating principles? And essentially what we need to begin to think about is how do we translate the transform model into the new settings that you might wish to use in your own right. Well, again, remember, there are these three components: the motivating assumptions, the formation and guidance strategies, and the monitoring and reflection strategies. And I believe that we can take 5 common sense, if you will, based at least on the transform experience, 5 operating principles for managing sustainable development. And again, we took a look at this diagram at the beginning of our webinar today, but let's fill it in now. You really have to focus on both impact and process performance. You have to care about the 3 Ps, but you've also got to care about the fact that you have the stakeholders fully engaged and really creating innovation and new knowledge together. Well, you're only going to get there if you manage the initiating conditions. The Kinji partners need to be in the room from day one. And you need to think about how you are going to engage them, not just in debating or compromising, because this isn't what this is about. This is about creating new knowledge together and finding new ways forward and not merely compromising old ways. So you've got to carefully manage these initiating conditions. And then you have to practice multi-stakeholder engagement every day in every way. And again, talking to the process monitors, it was really important to see the active engagement of all of the critical parties throughout the process. because when you get the active engagement of the various stakeholders, then you really have the diversity of thought to create the innovation that is necessary. And then that leads us to the notion that you have to practice innovation management successfully. You have to be thinking about how do we act on our ideas and not merely debate them. How do we really think about a new approach rather than simply rehashing the same old approaches? So that there has to be action learning, again, this notion of multidisciplinary learning. And the fifth and final part of this is you must practice monitoring and reflection. In the heat of developing new innovations and practicing multi-stakeholder engagement, you've got to take time to pause and reflect on what you have learned, where you have been, where are you going, and make corrections in the process all the way along. So what we're suggesting to all of you listening into the course is that if you want to do this, if you want to create a project that will be a sustainable development project, then these are the operating principles by which you must work. You begin by focusing on impact and process outcomes. You've got to take great care when you initiate the project, and then all along the way, you've got to practice multi-stakeholder engagement, innovation management, and monitoring and reflection. Now, if that doesn't make you sweat a little bit, then you don't fully understand the real challenge of managing sustainable development. But it is a process that Transforum, I think, provides ample evidence that it can work, but you've got to do it with great care. So when we think about applying the principles, how general are they? Well, I think there's a lot of support that they are quite general. Transforum had a diverse portfolio of projects, both more and less wicked, and the more wicked were more successful under these principles. There were both mainstream or large scale and small scale niche, and we saw little difference in performance, which means these principles can be utilized in both scales of projects. There were multiple types of innovation, and at least within the Transforum experience, we saw little performance difference, which gives us hope that the application of these principles can be quite broad to any form of innovation. We would certainly think that they are relevant beyond the Netherlands to other more mature agri-food economies that are facing similar problems. And I think there's little reason to question the application to developing agri-food economies, but certainly adjustments would have to be made for the low resource settings that tend to be true in those kind of economies. But at the same time, we have to be cautious about the use of these principles. One of the things I looked at and didn't report on earlier was how extreme were the external conditions to these various projects. Well, it turns out that they weren't very extreme. If you already have completely polarized stakeholders across the Kinji categories, probably bringing these operating principles to a situation that's already completely polarized, I think we would have to question whether or not it would work. It would take even greater care in such extreme conditions to be able to set up a Kinshie group that could in fact be functional. Obviously, we were only looking at agri-food projects across the 30 here, and the question would be, are these principles more widely applicable? Again, I think there have been other authors and researchers in other categories that would suggest that they probably are, but we were specifically looking at agri-food projects. And then managing projects when Transforum funding and strategies are not mutually reinforcing. For example, projects that engage with Transforum were able to get a very significant amount of funding from Transforum that helped keep the project folks keep their nose to the grindstone in terms of doing all of these things implied by the principles. And then the final caution is that going all the way back to those performance measures, there were only a few of the projects that got fully to real value creation. And again, you saw the 6 really star performers over these last 3 weeks. But getting to those kinds of outstanding outcomes require really hard work. But at the end of the day, folks, I think you would discover that if you implement these operating principles, you are going to have improved dramatically your ability to create shared value kinds of outcomes in the projects that you might do. Fortunately, we have a few minutes left here for some questions. I haven't been able to follow very many of the questions. I see Sander has been playing the role of giving some feedback to you. Are there some questions that you would like to put on the table for us here at the end of this session? I'm waiting patiently. I've put a lot of material in front of you today, and a lot of it is put in perhaps in a bit more academic form than you've seen in the last couple of weeks, and maybe many of you are just still trying to take it all in, as it were. Oh, here's a question. Are we planning lectures in which we give more details about the 5 principles and more case details? That would certainly be something that we could do in a follow-up course, because I think many of you, probably out of your own experiences, could share good examples of these 5 principles as well. But we do, in fact, want to do more work with these 5 principles moving forward. Oh, here's a really good question. Can you talk more about the problem of not having the financing that would empower projects? Well, I think this is a question that those of us at Michigan State University are facing right now, because we're attempting to create a similar set of projects in Detroit. And so we are working to create a multi-stakeholder steering committee to create projects that will be ongoing in this arena of metropolitan agriculture, which we have redubbed for our purposes in Detroit Metro Food Plus. And we have been able to get a large group of stakeholders working together, but we're now to the point that we believe that there will be some project ideas that we can pull together and propose funding to some key groups, including government and industry. And but we have discovered that that finding the financing for this kind of project is really quite important, and I don't know that we have found the absolutely key way to get it done. Um, can you give a couple of examples of multi-stakeholder engagements? Um, Probably in the couple of minutes that are left, all of the 6 cases that we looked at and are documented in the book that was given for the course were all based on the Kinsey idea of having knowledge institutions, government, entrepreneurs in business, and NGOs and societal organizations engaged. We will attempt to find some other sources of examples that we might give to you. Do you think there's a way not to get the government involved? Well, generally speaking, we have discovered that the government is a critical player in most instances, and that if you don't have government involved, then you have the potential to run into regulatory and political concerns that if you can have their engagement, it is important. Now, obviously, if you find yourself in a situation in which government players are not going to be helpful or may even be corrupt in some sense, I think this puts to a test how you go about effectively getting government involvement. But I think the presence of government is really essential, and finding key movers and shakers within government who will be open to innovation, I think, is especially critical. And I see James has mentioned that he shared some links about Metro Food, and I think that this is important. And then I guess a question more to James, is this project involve U of M and Eastern Market? Certainly Eastern Market has been critical to our organization. Well, I see we are in the last minute. Hopefully this has provided some additional thought-provoking ideas for those of you who want to continue to do the work with Metropolitan Ag. So thanks for coming in to the session today, and we certainly look forward to seeing you next week, which will be our final session of the MOOC. Have a good week. Thank you.